Hello students, it's Mrs. Sanzone and we're doing another set of notes. Today our topic and objective is cycles of matter. So please make sure you have your Cornell note paper in front of you, and in the topic/objective line you write in cycles of matter. Next we have to get to our essential questions. Our essential question today is actually 3 questions, and those include: what processes are involved in the water cycle? It's the first one. What processes are involved in the water cycle? The second question is: how are carbon and oxygen recycled in ecosystems? And the third is: what is the nitrogen cycle? So again, our topic and objective is cycles of matter, and today's essential questions are: what processes are involved in the water cycle? How are carbon and oxygen recycled in ecosystems? And what is the nitrogen cycle? Before we get started in the cycles themselves, I want to make a quick note about matter. At the beginning of the reading, it mentions what matter is, and so I want to make sure that we understand what matter is. Matter is any substance, basically, and it can come in 4 different forms: solid, liquid, gas, and something called plasma, which we're not going to focus on. So matter is any substance, and it comes in the form of solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. Here is a little picture just to remind you of what it is. The phases of matter: solid, we all know what a solid is, liquid, and gas. And matter is made up of tiny things called atoms. All matter is composed of atoms. And here's a little picture of what an atom might look like. So here we go. We have an atom. It's got the center of it is composed of something called protons and neutrons, and out here you have electrons. So here's an atom. All matter is composed of these tiny little things called atoms. Each individual atom is an element. Each individual atom is an element. This particular atom right here, it has 3 electrons, so that's the element lithium. But yes, each individual atom is an element. So other elements include oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon. Those are some of the main ones we will be talking about. Any two or more atoms together make up something called a molecule. And if the atoms in the molecule are all the same, the molecule is still an element. So if the atoms in the molecule are all the same, the molecule is still an element. So for example, oxygen happens to be a type of element that likes to travel around in pairs. So you often, when you talk about oxygen in the air, you're actually talking about not just oxygen atoms, you're talking about oxygen molecules that travel together. So an oxygen molecule is composed of 2 oxygen atoms together. And in this case, because both of those atoms are the same, that is still an element. If the atoms in the molecule are different, however, the molecule is no longer an element. It is something called a compound. And one compound that we're very familiar with is water. Water is composed of, this is a huge one, sorry. Water is composed of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. And since it's made up of more than 1 different kind of atom, it is no longer an element. It is now considered to be a compound. So there's just some basic things about matter that we need to consider when we're talking about cycles, and that will become hopefully a little bit clearer as we get going. So now we're going to get into cycles, and the first cycle we're going to discuss is something called the water cycle. A lot of you had a little song that you were able to come up with in class about what the water cycle is, and that's really, really, really great to keep in mind to help you remember what it is. Songs always work really well. Water is essential for life, and it has to be recycled to make sure that there's a steady supply of it on Earth. So that's something important that we need to know about the water cycle. What is the water cycle? Well, specifically, the water cycle is the continuous process by which water moves from Earth's surface to the atmosphere and then back again. So it moves in a circle, okay? It's the continuous process by which water moves from the Earth's surface to the atmosphere and back to the Earth's surface again. And it involves 3 different processes. It involves evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. Okay, again, the water cycle is the movement of water from the Earth's surface to the atmosphere and back. It involves evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. So let's talk about what those 3 words mean. And we'll start with evaporation. Before I do that, I want to make sure that we put in this picture. Here is a picture of what the water cycle looks like. Here, let's see. Let's move this up a little bit so we can see the whole thing. So you have water in the ocean that evaporates, goes and condenses into clouds, and then falls back to the earth, and it continues. You have these blue arrows showing that it continues to go around and around and around. So here we are going to talk about evaporation first. So what is evaporation? Evaporation is the process by which molecules of liquid water absorb energy and change into gas. So let's go back and look at our water molecule up here. So if we look at our water molecule again, it's made up of oxygen and hydrogen. And in the phase that we normally think of water in is liquid form, right? Or maybe you think about it in solid form when you think of ice. But water can also be in gas form, and that is like water vapor. And what happens is that when water is in liquid form and you heat it up, it absorbs energy, and those very energetic water molecules are able to escape the liquid and go up into the air into gas. So here we have a little picture of that here. So you have water, and this is in the liquid form down here. They're absorbing energy, and the ones that get enough energy are able to escape the liquid and into the gas form, and that's what evaporation is. It's important to know that that water evaporates from different areas on the planet. It evaporates from oceans, lakes, and other surfaces and forms a water vapor in the atmosphere. And another thing to keep in mind is that living things also give off water. For example, plants release water vapor from their leaves, and when you breathe and you exhale, you're actually breathing out water vapor as well. And you know that if you've ever tried to fog up a window or fog up a mirror with your breath, that water vapor then condenses onto the glass or the mirror. And it's able to do so because you've exhaled it. And here's some other important things to remember about evaporation. So here we have the evaporation is able to happen because of the sun's energy. And that's what heats up the water enough so that those molecules can escape, and that goes into the atmosphere. And a good way to help remember what evaporation is to think about any time you've ever had to boil water. So maybe you've made tea or you've made mac and cheese. That boiling water, this steam coming out, that's evaporation. It's water molecules getting enough energy to leave and turn into a gas. Now, after evaporation, we're going to talk about condensation. Condensation is the process, it's kind of like the opposite of evaporation. So evaporation is the liquid turning into a gas, and condensation is the gas turning back into a liquid. So condensation is the process by which a gas changes into a liquid. Okay, and this occurs when water vapor cools in the atmosphere. So anytime this water that has been able to escape the liquid form because it's gotten enough energy in the form of heat, suddenly meets with cool water and it turns back into a liquid form. So the water vapor cools and it collects. These little water droplets end up collecting around particles of dust and they end up forming clouds. So I have a little picture of what that looks like. Here we have, oops. Here we have the sun is heating up the water on the ground, and it's evaporating and rising. And as it rises, it starts to cool and condense around some dust particles, and it ends up forming clouds. So when you look up in the air, in the sky, and you see clouds, you can think condensation. That's water molecules that have evaporated and then cooled and condensed around some dust particles, and that's what clouds are. And the last part of the water cycle is precipitation, which is something you've probably heard a lot about specifically, or particularly because we live in Maine, and we're always concerned about snow days, which I don't know if we're going to have one this year. The weather's not looking like it's going to cooperate with us, at least not so far. But what is precipitation? Precipitation is specifically anything that ends up, any sort of water that ends up falling back to the ground. And it typically falls in these four forms: rain, snow, sleet, or hail. And I have a little picture too. And what they are is heavy drops of water vapor that fall from clouds back to the earth. And precipitation, in falling back to the earth, because the earth is made up of so much water, most of the precipitation actually falls directly into oceans and lakes. It falls directly into oceans and lakes. But some of it may also soak into the soil and become groundwater or run off the land and end up back into rivers and oceans. And here's some pictures of precipitation to keep in mind what it is. Let's see, I'm going to move this down. Okay, so precipitation. Here we have the different types of precipitation, and a lot of the types of precipitation depend on temperature. So snow, sleet, rain, and either freezing rain or hail, depending on what you want to call it. I guess freezing rain is probably sleet, or I guess not. So freezing rain is hail and sleet is sleet. Sorry. But yeah, those are the four different types of precipitation that we typically run into. And here's oops, that's not the one I wanted to use. Here's another picture that talks about the four that we have actually listed up here. I liked this picture better, but this one actually says rain, snow, sleet, and hail, as does our book. So I wanted to include that as well. I'm recording a video. Sorry. Next, we're going to talk about the carbon and oxygen cycles. The carbon and oxygen cycles are, although they're two separate, you can consider them to be two separate cycles, they're also very much linked together. So we're going to put them together when we title our next section of our notes. In ecosystems, the process by which carbon and oxygen are recycled are really, really closely linked. Producers, consumers, and decomposers play a big role in recycling carbon and oxygen. We talked a little bit about that in class when I drew a picture on the board of the flower going through the process of photosynthesis, and then the goat eating the flower. And so you can see how they were linked there, but we're going to talk a little bit more about that here. It's important to note that carbon is essential for life, and most organisms use oxygen to live as well. So both these elements, carbon is an element, oxygen is also an element, they're very, very essential for living things. And so it makes sense that they're linked together. The carbon cycle specifically looks like this. So let's put a little title here of what the carbon cycle is. What happens in the carbon cycle? Well, producers, such as flowers, any sort of plant, trees, producers take in carbon dioxide gas during photosynthesis to make sugars. And then when consumers eat the producers, they take the sugars that contain carbon and process them in their bodies. Oops. Sorry. When consumers eat producers, they take in the sugars that contain carbon and process them in their bodies. Next, consumers then release the carbon dioxide and gas as well as water back into the air as waste, or back into the environment as waste. So it doesn't always have to be in the air. And then when producers and consumers die, decomposers break down their remains and return carbon to the soil and to the air. So I'm going to actually add and air. And so I know this is a little bit confusing. So producers take in carbon dioxide during photosynthesis to make sugars. Consumers eat the producers, taking in those sugars that contain carbon, and then process them in their bodies, and then release carbon dioxide gas as well as water as waste. And then when producers and consumers die, decomposers also break down the remains and return more carbon to the soil and air in that way too. So here are some pictures of that cycle. Here, basic photosynthesis, here you have light energy coming in as well as carbon dioxide and water. The plants are making sugar and releasing oxygen. And to put this next to it, the plants are releasing this oxygen to human beings as well as any food that a human would take in that contains something from a plant is going to have sugars in it that the body processes, and then the human being is going to exhale carbon dioxide, and that's the cycle that it goes through. And we're actually going to do a lot more with the carbon cycle, but this is basically what our book talks about, and so that's going to be the focus of our notes for today. But we're actually going to do an activity with this on Friday that helps make this more clear. The oxygen cycle, again, is closely related to the carbon cycle. Producers release oxygen in photosynthesis, and other organisms take in oxygen from the air or water to live. Okay, so here we go. We're taking in oxygen, releasing carbon dioxide. Plants are taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. So they're very, very closely related. Here's one last picture. Oops, that's not the one I wanted to use. The other thing I wanted to talk about is that as far as the carbon and oxygen cycles are concerned, human beings really have a huge effect on how much carbon and oxygen are in the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels, cutting down trees, etc. So here we are, in addition to this nice carbon cycle that we're seeing here and the oxygen cycle that we're seeing here, it's a lot more complicated than what is on the page. And so here's a picture that really helps us see what else is involved in the carbon cycle. When we burn things, that releases carbon dioxide to the air, as well as burning any sort of fossil fuels. Those are going to affect how much carbon dioxide go into the air. Cutting down trees, if you're cutting down a lot of plants, you're cutting down those things that take in carbon dioxide, meaning that there's more left in the atmosphere. If you're driving around a lot in your car and you're burning oil and gasoline, that's going to really impact how much carbon dioxide is in the air, because that's what's coming out, carbon dioxide as well as carbon monoxide. And then we have burning things. Releases carbon dioxide to the air, and that not only includes having a forest fire, but it also includes power plants, like if you have a coal plant that's releasing carbon dioxide to the air, or factories that are releasing all sorts of things to the air, that's also contributing to the carbon dioxide. And that can actually make our world warmer and have a lot of negative impact. And the last cycle we're going to talk about today is something called the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen cycle. Oops. that's the next heading you need to have on your piece of paper, the nitrogen cycle. And what the nitrogen cycle is, it's the movement of nitrogen from the air to the soil into living things and then back into the air. Oops, it's not letting me do this. I apologize. Here we are, the nitrogen cycle. It's the movement of the nitrogen cycle. Oops, I guess I already had that twice. I apologize. The nitrogen cycle is the movement of nitrogen from the air to the soil into living things and then back into the air. And the fact of the matter is that, I don't know about you, but when I was younger and I thought about air, I thought about oxygen. I thought most of our air must be oxygen, when in fact, it's not. Most of the air, about 78% of our air around us is nitrogen. But nitrogen likes to travel around with itself, kind of like we talked about oxygen earlier. So nitrogen likes to travel around with another nitrogen atom attached to it, and it floats around in the air. And unfortunately, in this sort of situation, nitrogen isn't usable, and it needs to be something called fixed before plants and animals can use it for their benefit. And we really do need nitrogen, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. So something needs to happen called nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation is the process of changing free nitrogen into a usable form of nitrogen. And the way it happens is kind of really, really cool, and that happens mostly through bacteria. These bacteria, a lot of which live on the bumps of the roots of plants, and they make it so that nitrogen can be used by forming these nitrogen compounds. The other time nitrogen gets fixed is during lightning storms. Lightning actually produces enough energy in the air around nitrogen that compounds are formed that can also be used. So if you ever notice during, after a lightning storm, maybe your grass looks greener or better because of nitrogen fixation. So here are the bacteria that can do nitrogen fixation as well as lightning. And what nitrogen is used for, why is it important? Nitrogen is used to build proteins and other complex compounds that are necessary for life. When we do our cell unit, we're going to talk about proteins and what they do, cells and genetics. And they're really, really necessary for living things to function. And so nitrogen is quite important for that. So nitrogen is used by organisms to build proteins and other complex compounds that are necessary for life, and eventually it's turned back to the soil through decomposers and back to the air through bacteria in the soil. So here's a little picture that shows this nitrogen cycle. So there's nitrogen in the atmosphere that is then, nitrogen in the atmosphere that it gets fixed by bacteria, then can be used by plants that are eaten by animals and digested and returned to the soil, and then bacteria releases it back into the atmosphere. So those are our cycles today. Just to review, we went over what matter is. We talked a little bit about what's an atom, what's an element, what's a compound, what's a molecule. Then we talked about the water cycle. That involves evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. And we mentioned what that precipitation includes: rain, snow, sleet, and hail. Then we talked about the carbon and oxygen cycles, and that involves photosynthesis. That is then the plants that photosynthesize are eaten by organisms that then release carbon dioxide back to the air. And we mentioned how human beings can have a huge impact on the amount of carbon dioxide and oxygen in the air through the burning of fossil fuels and other activities such as cutting down trees, driving around in cars. And then we mentioned the nitrogen cycle, and that nitrogen makes up most of our air, but it's not usable, and that bacteria in the soil, bacteria on the roots of plants help fix nitrogen so that it can be used. Lightning also does this, and that nitrogen is used by organisms to do a lot of life processes and then is returned to the soil through decomposition and decomposers, and then is released back into the air through bacteria that live in the soil. So make sure you do your summary for these notes, and we will be going over them in class. Thanks so much.